We have a number of viewer questions. I have to tell you, in fact, our mailbox is jam full of viewer questions, so we're going to get to them in a second. But before that, I want to begin with your reaction, or at least try to get some reaction to these new travel rules. Are there concerns from your members about the impact these new rules might have on the industry?
Absolutely. I think that every time there's a new announcement with not a lot of details, then it actually causes havoc right across Canada and across the world. So certainly since the announcement on late Tuesday afternoon that we have had thousands of telephone calls from travelers who actually were quite in a panic at the beginning. But now things have settled a little bit. And I think that one of the things that's really important, and you mentioned it right up front, is that the government has made an announcement. At this point in time, they have not done a formal order, which means that, as you mentioned, the airports don't know exactly what is going to be expected. So that is really important for people to know. So it's coming, but right now, as everyone will probably know, there is random testing at airports across Canada, and that's what's happening today. It's the random testing. Now they have increased the testing, but as of today, nothing has changed. It is coming though.
Okay, well, that's an interesting backdrop because so many of the questions, not surprisingly, have to do with these new rules. And listen, let's get right to the viewer questions here, beginning with Heather and Wayne. And this is what they write, Wendy. They say, we live in Oliver, BC. Because the highways were closed, we ended up flying with Swoop Airlines from Kelowna to Abbotsford and then flew from Abbotsford to Puerto Vallarta via Swoop Airlines again. Now, they say we return on December the 10th, again via Swoop to Abbotsford. Our flight home to Kelowna is booked for December the 12th. I would like to know how this is going to work for our situation. And I guess this really has to do with connecting flights from an international destination, but your final destination is, in fact, another domestic location.
Yes. And so what we do know now, so there is random testing. So this could be in place when they're traveling, that when they're traveling from Mexico into Canada, that they, at this point in time, they may be required to take a random PCR test. And in that case, they can continue on their travels to their home destination, which I think you said was Kelowna. And then they are supposed to isolate until those test results become available. And so that is what the general rule is at this point in time.
Okay, and also add to that, of course, that airlines require masking during flight, etc. Let's bring in another question. This is from Lois, and Lois has this question for you. Do you need a COVID test 72 hours prior to departure if you have to have one on arrival? And she says, I'm traveling back from Mexico back to Canada.
Yes, so she will require a 72-hour PCR or molecular test to re-enter Canada. And then when she arrives at her airport in Canada, at this point in time, there is a good chance that she will be randomly selected because the random selection tests have increased. And that, so she does need that 72-hour test, and then she will have one potentially at the airport. So yes. And I do want to mention that I think that that is probably the most important point that travelers need to understand, is that we are, from the questions that we're getting in the travel agencies, that they're thinking that that 72-hour pre-test is being replaced by the airport test, and it is not. So that's really critical. And the other item that is causing a lot of confusion is that you hear the word PCR, you hear the word antigen, you hear the word molecular. All tests are not created equal. And there are a lot of Canadians who are showing up at airports with the incorrect test. And so it's really important that in the case of Canadians returning to Canada, that they have, well, all travelers coming into Canada, that it is the molecular or PCR test. So that is really important for people to understand.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So either molecular or PCR, that is the requirement that travelers are being asked. So good to know there.
Yeah.
Let's bring in another question. This is from Jim. And Jim writes, our son, who is double vaccinated, is attending university in the United States and plans to return home to British Columbia for the Christmas holidays in mid-December and return, he says, to the U.S. early in the second week of January. Would you be able to let me know, he is asking, what the COVID-related travel requirements are for his travel from and to the U.S. at this time?
So traveling into Canada, he is going to require a molecular or PCR test 72 hours prior, and then he may be tested upon arrival. He may have to isolate. Well, he will have to isolate if he's one of the chosen ones. By the time he travels at Christmas, it may be that everybody's getting tested. We don't know exactly what date that every single passenger will be tested at this point in time, because there are a lot of logistic challenges to work through. However, the fact that they're testing more and more travelers every day randomly, that travelers should expect that. When he goes back to school in January, at this point in time, he's going to require an antigen test because that's what the U.S. government accepts. And that's why I said this confusion around test. It's very important that people show up at the airport with the right test, or they will be denied boarding. So the United States is looking for antigen tests 1 day that are 1 day prior, and the Canadian government is looking for what's called the gold standard, so a higher restriction, which is the molecular or PCR test.
And I also want to add a note there, because there are some Canadians being turned away as they try to get back into Canada from the U.S. because they don't have the Arrive Can app on their phones and they don't have the information filled out properly.
Yes, I was going to mention that in a few minutes. That is vitally important. Canada has taken a very strong stance on all travelers using the Arrive Can app, and their Canadians or all travelers could be denied entry, or they actually could be required to quarantine for 14 days. So again, that Arrive Can app is critical.
Okay, very quickly, because I've got less than a minute, but I do want to ask from Jessica. This is interesting. She says, my husband and I are flying to my parents' home in Canada for Christmas. She says, I'm a Canadian citizen. He is British. We are both fully vaccinated. We are flying from London, UK to Detroit, Michigan. And then my father is picking us up in his car to cross the land border. We are, she says, unclear of what we'll have to do on arrival. What does this mean for us? Will we be given a test at the land border?
So the first thing that I want to say is that I highly recommend that travelers do not add a third country. So the safest thing to do, the most efficient thing to do at this time is to fly, in this case, let's say London to Toronto. Try not to add a third country. However, this is the situation that they're in. And so they will, of course, require 72 hours to have a molecular or PCR test to enter Canada. They are also going to have 1 day prior the antigen test to get into the United States. They could be tested upon arrival randomly in the States, and then they actually could be tested again at the Canadian border. They may have to quarantine in the U.S. So that one is a complex question for sure.